So with 2025 around the corner, which is when I wanted to do my Reboot Season 1 video, I figured I'd do an easier one on the same season first, since Season 1 of the reboot is probably the one I'm least familiar with out of any Total Drama or Disventure Camp season. Upon my second full rewatch, one thing that I became curious about was what if Damien had actually watched the show before signing up, since he was the only person to have that be the case, and I think that easily could have changed. Anyways, let's begin. So obviously in the first episode, Damien never having watched the show would change, and he would still be fairly nervous but nonetheless doesn't regret being there since he thinks he can win, using his smarts and willingness to adapt without posing too much of a threat to other players. Besides that though, nothing much changes here. His team still wins and Bowie still convinces his team to vote off Caleb. Episode 2, again, not much changes here. Maybe Damien is a little more forward-thinking with how to beat the other team, but I really don't think it makes much of a difference as Wayne's strategy was really effective, and even if he could predict or try to find a counter, he can only dodge cabbages for so long when they're being launched at everyone on board. So the Trout lose, and Axel is still voted off for being a bad leader. Literally nothing changes here. Damien would still be terrified even though he's watched the show since he's literally trapped in a booth filling with water. His team still wins and Michelle is voted out for being a fraud. Episode 4, once again, nothing much changes here. Damien wouldn't be able to do anything for his team since he's being chased by Scary Girl with a jackhammer the entire time, which he still gets voted out for doing on top of throwing a challenge. Episode 5. Okay, now we get to some more meaningful changes. Obviously, with Scary Girl voted out and knowing about the nature of the show, Damien would be more prepared and would never advocate for his team to vote him out, so nobody gets the buttons. He would use his scientific knowledge to escape the raptor, and saving his team, like in canon, would give him even more confidence than before. That said, he was already pretty active in this challenge, so I don't think he'd make his team go any faster. So they still lose, and now they vote Ripper off for being an obnoxious asshole, on top of blowing the challenge for a fart record. Also, because of Damien's newfound confidence, he would ask to join Priya and Millie's alliance. He has a confessional saying even though he knows Priya didn't really mean it when she said he was the love of her life, he figures that at least means she was impressed. And he's proven to be correct when Priya ecstatically accepts him into the alliance. Even though Millie has been shown to feel uneasy about letting more people into the alliance before, that was when it was Julia, and it was also later in the game when Millie was more involved in the game and had a stronger connection to Priya. Whereas right now, she's still a lot more focused on writing her book and sticking around to do research, so she wouldn't be offended by Damien and Priya getting along. Instead, she'd be studying their interactions, trying to figure out where on the scale of platonic to romantic they are. But for now, since it's too early to tell without more data. For the Catapult Challenge, Priya would go first instead of Ripper accidentally going, and because she has experience at Catapult Camp, she'd choose to play it safe and get 1,000 points for her team first. All the turns after that stay the same until Wayne scores, making them tied at 4,000 each. Since Chase is afraid and doesn't want to go, Damien would be on the ground formulating a strategy to get the maximum amount of points, helping Priya with her calculations by measuring the velocity of the catapult, but since no one can go twice before the whole team has gone and Priya already went, and Chase would be too afraid to go, it has to either be Z or Damien. Damien would choose to go, and even though he doesn't have the same acrobatic skill as Priya, his idea to launch him super far would work as Priya tells him to tuck in the air, and he and Bowie both earn another 3,000 points each, still having a tie with 7,000 each now. Either way, doesn't really matter because Z is still going to win for his team and MK is still going to end up voted off for the same reason as canon. Julia still tries to split Emma and Chase apart, but accidentally does the opposite. Damien tags along with Millie and Priya, and since Priya saved Millie, she would save Damien too. So when the three of them get to Chris, both Damien and Millie would tell Priya she deserves immunity, and since she knows it'd be kinda weird to single out one of them as deserving of immunity over the other, she just takes it. Since the reason she offered it to Millie in the original was clearly just to be polite even though she didn't actually want her to take it. The hockey bros still get medically evacuated. Episode 8's challenge would still begin with Millie instantly quitting, not wanting to eat the gross food, which pisses off Priya and Damien, as they both spend some time as a duo without her. However, Millie is still in the background, secretly taking notes on their interactions. Millie says it's still hard to tell which way her research is pointing, because every time it seems like Damien and Priya are getting romantic, they either get interrupted by the gross food or Chase and Emma's absolute blowout, both of which are external variables that get in the way of her experiment. She's not the only one to notice though, since Julia tells Damien and Priya how cute of a couple they make, and says it must be nice to not care about each other's germs while describing them in great detail, making both of them hurl. And she still explains how milk is made to Z, making him hurl as well. And without Ripper there, Julia wins immunity much more easily now. So this vote is interesting because with Julia still having immunity, there's not really anyone blatantly in the red zone. But I do think, knowing how cunning Bowie is from when he convinced everyone to vote out Caleb, Julia would basically pull the exact same thing on him. She can easily get Chase's vote since he just had a huge fight with Emma, and she could convince him that separating her from Bowie would give her more time to spend with Chase, and then he can win her back, which Chase obviously believes. Bowie and Emma are both voting for Chase, making it 2-2. So it really comes down to the alliance of 3, since that outnumbers Z. Julia would approach Priya's alliance and ask them to vote out Bowie. And at first they don't trust her since she's been pretty openly hostile towards everyone, not to mention causing Priya and Damien to forfeit the challenge by hurling, but Julia points out that since she has immunity, and damn well knows she can keep winning immunity, she doesn't need to consult them. Rather, she's doing it for everyone's best interest. She further elaborates by explaining what Bowie did to Caleb at the first episode, and can easily convince them that he's the biggest threat in the game, besides her of course. And even though they might not believe her fully at first, when Damien confronts Bowie and Emma about this, Emma does a really bad job lying on Bowie's behalf, despite Bowie's best efforts to cover it up. So, Priya's alliance ultimately decide Julia has a point, and all of them vote with her, and I could honestly see Z getting on this too. So this makes it a 5-2 or 6-2 vote against Bowie. Bowie is irate at the irony of how he lost for the exact thing he did at the very beginning of the season, and is happy he can at least be with Raj now. Julia tries to join Priya's alliance again, but this time they don't bite since they already have 3, and without Bowie, Julia is by far the biggest threat left, which when pointed out makes Julia realize she kinda shot herself in the foot. Priya's alliance still tries to persuade Z so that they have the majority, and Julia tries to form an alliance with Chase and Emma. Problem is, once Chase inevitably tells Emma about how he voted Bowie off as an act of love for her so they can spend more time together, this infuriates Emma and makes her refuse to work with him at all, not even for the game, even before the challenge starts. Julia has a confessional upset that all her cutthroat moves are blowing up in her face. Julia decides to just say screw it and go for immunity, which she ends up getting without Bowie there to interfere. Now, because Z only got asked to be in one alliance this time, he would actually believe he's a part of it and not try to unite the merge cast, meaning Priya's alliance does have the majority. And Z just plainly admits to Julia when she tries to get him to vote for Priya, and he's like, yeah, I don't think I can do that, I'm in an alliance, that's the rule. Which makes Julia punch the screen in fury in the confessional. She ultimately accepts that the alliance isn't going to budge, so she just votes off Chase with everyone else, and he and Emma never get the chance to patch things up. Episode 10. Now that they have the majority on their side, Priya would actually relax a little. She'd still be very game-focused, but now she wouldn't feel the need to do training super early every morning, instead nerding out with Damien about the science behind the bee cave from last challenge, and also trying to predict what the next challenge would be. Millie continues writing and concludes there's definitely a connection between Priya and Damien. They're just both too lacking in self-confidence and erratic to ask each other out. Millie makes it clear that she refuses to intervene one way or the other since that would get in the way of her research, although she is secretly rooting for them since she likes both of them. Priya wouldn't be nearly as tired without going on the hike, but she would still ask Millie to read her notebook to get to know her better. And with Julia desperate to find a wedge in her alliance, she encourages Millie to show Priya the notebook and is like, what have you got to hide? Priya sees right through this and calls Julia out on it, but Julia continues to press her on it, saying if Millie really is her friend, she wouldn't hide this from her. The two continue arguing until Z interrupts and says, yo, stop fighting. Together we can figure this out. Maybe Millie would feel better about sharing if we relax the vibes, man. Damien has a confessional saying, that gives me an idea. Damien tells Millie he actually agrees with Julia, and that the two of them should come down from the polls and get it so that they can read it to everyone. Damien figures whatever is in the notebook isn't too bad and just mildly embarrassing friendship stuff, and he's also getting really exhausted from the challenge, so he sees this as a win-win to get Julia out of the challenge early, stop the argument, and get closer to the challenge being over all at once. Julia has a confessional not liking this plan since all the fake yoga makes her actually really good at this challenge, so she doesn't give up until about 30 minutes later, when Priya chimes in telling her she'll shove her off anyway, and normally this wouldn't scare Julia, but with Priya really wanting to see the notebook and her pointing out it's the only way she'll know she's not full of crap, this does actually persuade Julia to take the deal, and she and Millie ultimately come down. As for Damien, I think he'd probably be the next to give up since he'd be able to last a while, maybe to about the 11-hour mark, but the other 3 just have more stamina. Now between Priya, who's no longer exhausted from the morning hike, Emma, who originally won this challenge, and Z, who probably feels numb all the time anyway, and I imagine can stay on the pole basically forever, it's hard to say who's gonna win immunity now, since I could see all 3 of them lasting exponentially longer than the challenge originally went for. And without Chase there, my best guess would be that Z would start straight up hallucinating and throw his prosthetic leg at the person next to him, which would be Priya thinking he's giving them a gift or something. But since Emma was already hallucinating, I think Priya would dodge it, and this would startle Emma and she'd attack Z, knocking them both off and giving Priya immunity. Millie, having basically been forced to accepting Julia's idea, would lie and pretend she lost the notebook. But eventually Julia finds it since they were already searching everywhere in the cabins, and because she found it, she reads every single thing she said about Priya, trying to make it sound as horrible as possible without adding anything else, so she can show it to Priya and everyone and nobody can call her out for lying or sabotage. It's also worth noting that this would probably be even worse than in the original, because on top of writing about Priya's parents, she would also write about Priya and Damien, and there would be witnesses there, so this would actually make Millie look even worse. Millie tries her best to defend herself, but it's not enough to save her from being voted off by everyone, including Priya. It's also worth mentioning Millie never wrote the last part with the positive stuff about Priya yet, just to add insult to injury. Episode 11, Julia tries to essentially replace Millie in her alliance with Priya and Damien, claiming she did them a favor by exposing her. But Julia says Millie was right about one thing, which is that you guys are such a cute couple. Julia tells them she knows a power couple when she sees one based on her experience as an influencer and such. And according to her numbers, they're number one on the list. This makes both of them blush since a part of each of them has feelings for each other, but Damien is too shy and has a confessional saying Priya is out of his league. And Priya has a confessional saying she thinks Damien is cute, but she knows the dangers of dating during the game, especially starting a relationship in the final 5. And even though neither of them exactly trust Julia, they have to admit they could definitely benefit from having full control of the votes. And they also admit Julia was right about Millie, so yeah, they all work together. Z would lose his phone midway through the challenge, so he's out, and Julia would be nudging Damien and Priya closer to each other. And from there, the episode is actually very similar to the original. Damien takes Millie's place, elevating himself from being dead weight and saving Priya from the alligator, which brings both of them much closer together. And other than that, Julia wins immunity, beating Emma like in the original, blaming the martial arts turtle's death on Emma, and Emma is eliminated for being a threat. Episode 12. Julia catches Priya and Damien actually kissing and officially becoming a couple, and has a confessional realizing she's much better off keeping Z in the finale and splitting them apart. So for now, she pretends to still be on their side and she's like, OMG, you're together, I'm so happy for you. Priya can see right through this though, and she actually has the exact same thought process as Julia in the sense that booting her as the biggest threat makes the most sense. Julia would approach Z and try to explain to him that strategy-wise it makes no sense to stick with Priya and Damien now, since they're just gonna gang up on him in the finals if she's gone. Z simply responds, oh, they're dating? Wow. Good for them. Julia has a confessional frustrated since nothing she's saying is getting through to him. She ultimately figures out a way to get him to not work with Priya and Damien by pressuring him to, quote-unquote, not be a third wheel, which after several excruciating minutes of explaining, Z understands, and agrees to let them go at it alone. Once they're all trapped in the cave, Priya and Damien ask Z if he's coming since they're still in an alliance, but Z insists he doesn't want to interrupt their romantic getaway. Priya and Damien try to explain that's not what's happening, but they can't get through to him before Julia distracts them by collecting coins. And so they decide it's not worth wasting any more time and continue on without him. Julia has a confessional happy saying 1 down, 2 to go. Now in this timeline, Damien is a lot braver than in the original at this point, but Priya just kept throwing coins at Millie super fast and she dropped almost all of them, and Damien would probably make the same mistake here. He might point out to Priya that it would make more sense to put them in her bag instead of throwing them, so they'd maybe have a few more than Priya and Millie did, but not by nearly enough to get more than Julia, who just goes at it alone, and without Bowie there to slow her down, she'd still get just as much, if not a few more coins. So I guess just round 286 up to 300. Damien and Julia would keep exploring different parts of the cave to find more until they hit the waterfall, where they land on Z. Z apologizes for interrupting them, but Priya figures out Julia talked to him to hinder the alliance pretty fast, and so she comes up with an idea. She says, hey, you know what would be a really great gift for our 1-day anniversary? A whole lot of coins. Z is like, wow, that's a great idea. Aw man, I have no idea where to find any of those. Damien notices Z seems bummed out, and he asks why, and Z says he lost his other prosthetic leg somewhere. And Damien and Priya, figuring they really have nothing better to do at this point, having looked everywhere for coins, decide to help Z find it. And they ultimately end up getting eaten by the monster where they find the leg, and of course, enough coins to beat Julia for immunity. But this time, Damien and Priya tell Z he should be the one to get immunity, since he was the reason they beat Julia. And in exchange, he sticks to their alliance and votes Julia off, which is exactly what happens. Unlike when Millie was here, there's no notebook to use to hinder Priya's relationship with Damien, so the only thing Julia can really do is try to trick Z into voting for Priya or Damien causing a tie. But even then, I think at this point Z would just pretend to agree and then vote Julia anyway, which would work, because Julia expects Z to be stupid, so she would think her Hail Mary worked when it really didn't. So because Priya was the only one in the finale originally, and her partner is now also in the finale, nobody would have the same partner. So I used a random number generator to pick new ones. Coincidentally, I actually think what I landed on by chance fits pretty well for what the show might do. Priya got Millie, Damien got Bowie, and Z got Scary Girl. Priya and Millie's dynamic would actually be pretty similar to canon, with Millie profusely apologizing for what she wrote about her, and insisting Julia ruined their friendship, and even telling her she wrote another page talking about how much she admires Priya. But this of course just angers Priya even more, since to her it just sounds like she's doubling down. The difference is, though, that Priya needs Millie's help to make a raft, so she doesn't completely shun her, instead telling her to shut it and focus on the challenge. Without Ripper giving Millie the idea to sabotage her, Millie would figure the easiest way to get Priya's forgiveness is to help her win the game. Bowie would likely try to finesse Damien for some of the prize money in exchange for helping him, and Damien is a lot more confident in this universe, but he is still put in a pretty desperate position, so he ultimately counter-negotiates Bowie into an 80-20 split in his favor, and the two of them using their combined strength are pretty much neck and neck with Priya. Scary Girl would be nothing but a huge nuisance, finding ways to hurt Z and everything around him, and they'd basically just be running in circles with her chasing him down. Priya and Millie are able to get a slight lead, with Damien's raft being a bit more sturdy. Priya, Damien, and their partners would be taken aback by the lava, but without the sabotage of Priya's raft, it'd actually be pretty smooth sailing, especially since Z is so far behind, so there's much less pressure. Damien wishes good luck to Priya as they paddle to see who finishes first, since it doesn't really matter as long as they beat Z. But Priya's competitive spirit and remembering the whole purpose of her training up to this point would get the better of her, and she'd awkwardly be like, yeah, when Damien says it's not a big deal no matter which of them wins. Damien would notice this, and it would ignite a light feud between the couple, when just then, Scary Girl accidentally chops a huge chunk of logs with Z on it, launching him all the way to the lava directly on top of Priya and Millie. The collision forces Z to jump on Damien's raft, while Priya does a flip all the way to the finish line. Chris announces Priya making it to the final two, and Millie cheers, while Z and Damien are hugging each other, screaming in fear with what just happened. Bowie would have a confessional saying he really needs Damien to win, but he also knows that that would pretty much doom him and Priya's relationship, and he doesn't know how much he can really trust Damien to actually win given the circumstances, especially with Priya already being the better player. So Bowie concocts a last-minute plan to purposefully sabotage Damien's raft, ever so slightly so neither of them finish, tripping Damien on the raft and telling Z he'll help him escape the lava and get him across the finish line for a 50-50 split of the money. And Z, still terrified, agrees. Damien is outraged by the betrayal and gets into a wrestling match with Bowie, which lets Z get to the finish line, getting Damien eliminated. Damien is furious at Bowie, and Bowie tells him, sorry, that's business. But Damien quickly turns his frown into a smirk, telling Bowie it doesn't matter, cause Priya's gonna kick his butt by proxy anyway. So now it's down to the final two, and come on, I think it's pretty obvious who's winning here. Sure, Priya does have a lackluster start, getting behind as her goats scatter, and I do think Z would actually start off with a decent lead since he's good with animals, and getting the goats up the hill shouldn't be too much trouble. But once he does get on top of the hill, Z would be forced to drink a bucket of milk, which, thanks to Julia, is now his biggest fear. And Z has zero adrenaline, meaning being in the finale wouldn't motivate him in the slightest, giving Priya more than enough time to catch up. I do think Bowie would run up the hill and try to talk to Z out of his fear, and after some convincing this could work, but by that point Priya would be too far in the lead for it to matter, winning the season right before Z starts to drink the milk. Priya celebrates her ultimate victory with Damien, and Z is relieved he doesn't have to drink any milk. Also, because Millie was a lot more helpful compared to the original, and Priya forgave Millie after her confession, I think after winning the season, they'd be able to keep their friendship intact here as well. Just happening at the very end of the episode instead of halfway through the challenge. So that was the video. Hope you enjoyed it, and my next series of Total Drama videos is going to be focused on the winner's bracket, which you may remember I made a trailer for a while back. Well, now that we've reached the new year, or are about to depending on when this comes out, that's going to be next on the docket. Until then, I'm a musical individual, and I'll see you then.